Hello, Fans Conference. I hope your weekend has been going well. I'm Dr. Eric Wesselmann, a professor of psychology at Illinois State University. I'm happy to have the opportunity to chat with you today virtually about a series which I'm a huge fan, Netflix's Fear Street trilogy. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Netflix released a film trilogy inspired by R.L. Stine's Fear Street series, a young adult horror novels published from 1989 to 1999, and then revived in 2014. The audience for the bulk of these novels fit in the age cohort commonly termed Generation Y, or millennials, folks born between 1981 and 1996. Director Lee Janik, born in 1980, is a self-described fan who grew up reading these books. Janik and the creative team shot these films in tandem and released them over a 3-week period, one film each week, on Netflix's streaming platform. Narratively, these films take place over a 3-century arc, centered in 3 specific historical periods. The first film, Fear Street 1994, is set in that same year and full of nostalgic references that viewers from Generation Y, and some people from Generation X, folks born between 1965 to 1980, would recognize and likely appreciate. These references both draw on slasher films and broader popular culture for that decade. The second film, Fear Street 1978, focuses on an older character's flashback to that time and similarly involves nostalgic references for that period, catering to a Generation X audience. The first half of the third film, Fear Street 1666, travels further back in time, and then halfway through returns to 1994 setting, dubbed Fear Street 1994 Part 2, using mid-film titles inserts. Now, of course, these films are commercial products and thus need to strike a precarious balance between catering to a target audience and appealing to new audience members, perhaps unfamiliar with the source material's cultural zeitgeist. This is something Netflix acknowledged on their website when they promoted this trilogy. Thus, I argue that the Fear Street trilogy serves as both an unapologetic love letter to Generation Y nostalgia and an introduction to a new generation of viewers to the Fear Street universe. I was born the same year as Janik, and just like her, I also grew up reading the Fear Street series. As such, the narrative core of my argument will be a synergy between my personal experiences with this trilogy and the original source material, as well as context drawn from published interviews of the creative team and social science and humanities scholarship. Fair warning, there will be spoilers. Though this trilogy is an adaptation of the original series, the films do not directly adapt any specific storyline, and at best only loosely draw on the series mythos, electing instead to create a new self-contained storyline. This change afforded Janik and the creative team the opportunity to tell a story that could speak to current social concerns as well as those of the original stories. The trilogy focuses on Dina, a teenager living in Shadyside, her brother Josh, and her circle of friends. Dina's story in 1994 begins with the viewer learning that she has broken up with her girlfriend Sam, who recently moved to the neighboring town of Sunnyvale. Whereas Sunnyvale is an upper middle class community considered to be one of the nicest places to live in the country, Shadyside is impoverished and regularly beset with murderous sprees, so it's nationally become known as the Killer Capital USA. Herein lies the intergroup tension that ultimately drives the plot and the character drama throughout the films. After a series of mean-spirited pranks goes wrong, the characters themselves find themselves pursued by Skull Mask and other supernatural killers linked to an ancient curse, presumably evoked by Sarah Fier, spelled F-I-E-R, but pronounced Fear. Sarah was executed for witchcraft in 1666, back when Shadyside and Sunnyvale were one town called Union. Now, through the narrative, we learn that the Union resident who actually was involved in malevolent witchcraft was Solomon Good, and he framed Sarah. Further, Solomon started a cycle of diabolical pacts that every few years offers the soul of one person from the part of town that would become Shadyside. And that person then would become a possessed murderer. These murders were sacrifices, ensuring the good family and those citizens who lived in what would be the area that would be called Sunnyvale continued prosperity across generations. This pact and Solomon's perspective narratively illustrate the worldview that psychologists have termed social dominance orientation. The perspective that human life naturally involves a hierarchy, with one group ensuring dominance by subjugating others. And folks who hold this perspective then use it to justify ignoring or outright engaging in supporting systemic inequality. Once Dina and her friends discover this truth, they then seek to break this cycle by killing Sheriff Nick Good, who has been continuing this diabolical pact and sacrificing Shadyside residents to ensure his family's legacy. Though the story is new, there are a few nods to the original Fear Street books. At a cursory level, Dina likely is named after the main character of The Wrong Number, the fifth book of the Fear Street series. However, the similarities end with the characters' names. Though not directly related to the Fear Street books, the Skull Mask Killer bears a striking resemblance to Halloween Night 2, another young adult novel by R.L. Stine. Special thanks to @Dr. Wolfula for that observation. Now, Camp Nightwing, which is the camp in the flashback sequence in 1978, provides a reference to Lights Out, the 12th book in the Fear Street series. Again, the name is where the similarities end. Finally, in one brief shot in 1994, part 2, we see a shot that establishes the existence of a Fear Street, although in this case named FIER. There are more direct links to the three-part Fear Street saga, which was a trilogy of novels published in 1993. And this trilogy provides a prequel to the main series and explains, quote unquote, where the terror began. This trilogy sets up an intergenerational conflict between the Good and Fear families that begins in the Massachusetts-based witch trials hysteria of 1692. Though the Netflix series borrows the names of these two families and the spirit of American colonial witch persecutions that is epitomized in Fear Street 1666, the plot connections go no further. Finally, the character of Sarah Fear as a possessing spiritual force likely is a connection to the 5-book Fear Street Cheerleaders miniseries, which started in 1992 and finished in 1998. Again, this connection is topical as the character of Sarah Fear in the books differs vastly from the characters in the Netflix trilogy. Still, fans of the original Fear Street series, who can appreciate a conceptual nod without involving a literal translation, likely will appreciate the reference. Now that I've given the general plot context, I will center the concept of nostalgia, as that will be the theoretical core of my subsequent analysis. Psychologists and other affective scientists who study nostalgia argue that it is an ambivalent, though mostly positive, emotional experience, characterized by a wistful longing and a desire to connect with a past time. Nostalgia is also common. Not only is it pan-cultural, but some data suggest that people can experience it daily. A large body of research suggests that there are many psychological benefits to experiencing nostalgia, such as providing an increased sense of belonging, self-esteem, and meaning. These are psychological needs that most, if not all of us, need fulfilled in some way to be psychologically and physically healthy. Nostalgia has an important function for our identities, our sense of self. Research suggests that nostalgia serves to balance the tension between consistency and change, maintaining self-coherence amid a constant experiential self-development. Objectively, we are not the same people we were 10 years ago. A lot can happen in a decade, whether it be massive social level events like a global pandemic or socio-political upheaval, or dramatic personal events such as relationship changes and other milestones, whether they be positive or negative. Further, even seemingly small events like reading a new book, hearing a new song, or attending a cool conference can impact our personal outlooks, our understanding of relating to others, and our being in the world. Maybe, like me, you have had experiences where you've reconnected with someone you've not seen in several years, and you're surprised when they tell you how much they think that quote unquote you've changed. Now, I often think, no, I haven't. I'm the same general person in 2023 that I was in 1994, albeit a little less hair up top, a little more on my face. But we observe the changes in our self concept over a longer time scale. We see how all the pieces fit together. We've created a story in our identity's evolution. And here is where nostalgia comes in. Even though most nostalgic memories focus on positive, socially meaningful events in our development, even negative events can be nostalgic in that, retrospectively, we reflect on these events as being crucial to our personal growth. I wouldn't be who I was today if I didn't go through the crap that I did so many years ago. Okay, now on to the Fear Street trilogy, specifically Fear Street 1999. Now, in many ways, the pre-credits introduction to the pre-credits introduction sequence, which runs about 7 minutes and 30 seconds, provides a nostalgic microcosm that is representative of the whole trilogy. It opens with a black screen and a voiceover narration that says, "It began as a prank and ended in murder." Then the first actual shot we get is someone holding a book. In the first line, we see the book's was actually the book's tagline. Now, this book is the wrong number, which I've already mentioned. Now, note that this book has a slightly different cover than the original, which prominently says Fear Street at the top. Now, as we'll discuss, this film has some meta moments, as well as do the other two films in the trilogy, but they're not that meta. The young woman holding the book, Heather, is a clerk at the B. Dalton bookstore. Now, any 1990s era adolescent who spent any time at all being a mall rat likely wandered around into this store franchise, possibly to buy Fear Street books or other young adult horror. Now, right after this interaction ends, the soundtrack switches from the ambient sounds of the store to non-diegetic pop music. The first few percussive notes of Nine Inch Nails' song Closer, the big radio single from their 1994 album, The Downward Spiral. Now, any adolescent who listened to alternative rock radio stations around that time likely became familiar with those initial drum machine beats, the controversy that the song and video engendered, and the feelings of teenage rebellion by listening to a band disapproved of by many parents. Now, while this song plays, viewers experience an MTV music video-esque montage of images that shows the mall closing down for the night. The narrative then returns to Heather dancing around the store, presumably to Nine Inch Nails. She then has a phone conversation with Ryan, another teenager who is working at a novelty store. Now, though this store is never named, it looks suspiciously like Spencer Gifts, another common mall hangout for 1990s teenagers. Now, as Heather continues to close the store, the non-diegetic soundtrack switches to suspenseful score music. The camera pans past a bookshelf with multiple Fear Street books, though, again, the Fear Street logo is absent. Also note that the book's author, Robert Lawrence, is listed as opposed to R.L. Lawrence Stine. Again, a fun metatextual reference because Fear Street fans will get it, but new and unfamiliar viewers would not be distracted by this type of esoteric reference. Now, eventually, Skull Mask Killer appears, accompanied by startling and quick audio stings. A struggle and chase ensues, and Heather is tragically murdered by Skull Mask. As Heather lies dying, she unmasks her killer to reveal her peer Ryan, who seems not to recognize her as he unemotionally focuses on her demise. The audience then experiences Ryan being shot in the head by the sheriff, who arrives just in time to be too late to save Heather. Only then do the official opening credits begin to roll. Let's further unpack this nostalgia microcosm. I already mentioned the brief metatextual references to the Fear Street books, as well as other popular culture references to 90s mall culture. The use of pop music throughout these films is another nostalgia cue. Janik has noted in several interviews how the use of period-appropriate popular music for the portion set in 1994 and 1978 was crucial for provoking audience nostalgia, transporting them into the time of each film. Janik further notes that the first film in particular allowed her to relive at her own adolescence to a degree. Now, most, though not all, of the popular music used in each film was released during the respective time periods. Regarding the album's score, which we see on the left-hand side of the screen is the cover for the uh, limited edition vinyl-only release of the Fear Street score. Janik noted in those liner notes that she also wanted each period's score to reflect the popular horror films from their respective decades. Research demonstrates that music is a powerful nostalgia cue, especially for music that individuals are familiar with and have important memories associated. Interestingly, individuals do not need to have a personal direct experience with a historical period to have nostalgic reactions. In other words, you don't have to be born in a particular decade to have nostalgia for that decade. They need only have a positive and idealized view of that period and its cultural products, such as music. Some nostalgia scholars have referred to this as historical nostalgia. This type of nostalgia is acquired socially, sometimes from a broader culture's beliefs about a particular time period, or other times from experiences in one's own more immediate social circles. Perhaps one learned about music from a particular decade because one's older siblings or relatives enjoy that music and exposed us to that. So we could have developed nostalgic feelings for music from that decade because of our relationships with these individuals. Now, such nostalgic reactions would likely occur for Generation Y audience members when watching Fear Street 1978. And they may even occur for viewers in future generations, depending upon their exposure to songs from both 78 and the films that had portions set in the 1990s. Now, if nothing else, these films will expose younger generations to popular songs from all these periods. Indeed, Janik has noted that those were additional goals when creating these films. There are many examples of using popular music to embed each of these films in their larger zeitgeist. For example, the main characters of Dina and Sam make each other mixtapes, an image here taken from Fear Street 1994's opening credits. And mixtapes were a common practice between friends and romantic partners during the 1980s and 90s, a practice later updated to making mixed CDs when the popular media format for music consumption changed. Dina and Sam reference listening to the band The Pixies multiple times throughout this trilogy, and one of their mixtapes is titled Must Be a Devil Between Us, which are lyrics derived from the Pixies song Hey. Now, this song plays towards the end of the first film. The trilogy also closes with two songs from the Pixies, Gigantic and Mr. Griever. Dina also has stickers on her door, as well as posters for grunge and alternative rock groups popular in the early to mid 1990s, such as the Melvins and PJ Harvey. Dina's brother Josh also has a Beastie Boys poster and wears an Iron Maiden t-shirt at different points during the film trilogy. The Fear Street trilogy goes beyond simply using popular music as a nostalgia-inducing cue and uses it as a storytelling device as well. For example, there are two specific moments where a period appropriate cover song is used to establish a theme in 1994, and then the earlier version of the song is used again in the period set in 1978. So in the first film, Janik uses the Cowboy Junkies cover of the Velvet Underground song Sweet Jane. This cover was released originally in 1988, but found a second life on the radio when re-released on the Natural Born Killers soundtrack, the film directed by Oliver Stone and released in 1994 in August. Now, given Fear Street 1994 is set in October of 1994, the main characters likely would have heard Sweet Jane on their alternative rock radio stations. The Cowboy Junkies cover version serves as a love theme both in Natural Born Killers and also here in Fear Street 1994. Then, the original version of Sweet Jane is used as a love theme in Fear Street 1978. Now, again, in Fear Street 1978, Janik introduces the character of Christine Ziggy Berman, a survivor from the 1978 Camp Nightwing massacre. When Ziggy is first introduced, Nirvana's 1994 unplugged rendition of David Bowie's song "The Man Who Sold the World" is played. Now, though the intentional use of cover songs may simply have been a small yet clever way to connect the two decades, I argue that these pairings fit nicely within the literature on nostalgia as serving for a continuity function. First, some music scholars have argued that cover songs, which have existed throughout most of modern musical history, have been popular partly because of the nostalgia they induce in listeners. Thus, Fear Street viewers familiar with both songs, or at least familiar with the 1990s versions, and aware that they were covers of older songs, would already be put into a nostalgic mindset when the first musical cue occurs, and then primed to notice the thematic similarities when the original songs are used later on in the trilogy. In the case of Ziggy Berman, this musical pairing acts to center her in 1978. Christine is the narrator for and the main character of the flashback sequence. When she first is introduced to viewers with this Nirvana cover, she is presented as a deeply traumatized person who needs multiple alarm clocks to remind her to do various mundane tasks, such as eating, locking the doors, watching her favorite TV shows, and feeding her dog, Major Tom. Though not directly stated, both her dog's name and her nickname, Ziggy, suggest she is a fan of David Bowie, referencing the lyrics from his song Space Oddity and his Ziggy Stardust stage persona from the early 1970s. Then, towards the end of the 1970s flashback sequence, after she and her sister are killed by these supernatural slashers, the David Bowie version of The Man Who Sold the World plays as she is being resuscitated by her friend and fellow camper Nick Good. Now, if one views this trilogy repeatedly, they may experience Ziggy's interactions with Nick differently, knowing that he is responsible for the demonic possessions and subsequent murders in this film, as well as in 1994. Now, personally, during my second viewing, I experienced Nick as the man who sold the world. Regardless of whether it's the first time or subsequent viewings, this soundtrack pairing works to forge narrative continuity between past and present, which I consider a type of narrative nostalgia. Janik argues that she wanted to forge a sense of historical continuity across this trilogy of films, suggesting that the residents of Shadyside were caught in a cycle of trauma. Or, as Ziggy says in 1978, in Shadyside, the past is never really past. However, Janik uses this cycle narratively to provide a tension that the main characters ultimately overcome at the end of the third film. Filmmakers can elicit cultural nostalgia using cues other than musical or topical references. In the Fear Street trilogy, Janik evokes nostalgia by referencing film styles from previous eras slasher films. Janik notes that she was influenced heavily by Scream, a film released in 1996 from director Wes Craven. Though technically this film premiered 2 years after the Fear Street trilogy's general time setting, horror scholars like Alexander West argues that the Scream film epitomizes the 1990s horror film aesthetic, especially in the slasher subgenre, which sometimes is called neo-slashers or postmodern slashers. Now, these films generally involved editing styles that were frenetic, channeling vibes from MTV music videos, as well as narratively centering adolescent women as three-dimensional characters, with both individual and interpersonal agency. Further, these films did not shy away from having their main female characters exhibit sexual agency. In the Fear Street trilogy, the same is true with the characters Dina, Sam, and Dina's friend Kate. Janik notes that she also drew on aesthetics from horror films in the 1970s and 80s, especially traditional slasher films for Fear Street 1978. Certainly, the sexuality was more prominent in the second film, with its detailed sex scenes, something that neo-slasher scholar Alexander West argues was downplayed in the 1990s neo-slasher films compared to the slasher film form of the 1970s and 80s. Though technically released after the setting of the second film, Janik references Friday the 13th by director Sean Cunningham, released in 1980, as providing inspiration. Personally, when this film's killer dons a burlap sack as a mask, I was also reminded of Jason in Friday the 13th Part 2, released in 1981 by director Steve Miner. Further, Janik notes that she wanted the character of Cindy Bergman, Ziggy's sister, to represent the morally uptight, often sexually repressed character that normally survive these classic slasher films. The type of character who horror scholar Carol Clover termed the final girl in her study of slasher films and other types of popular horror films of the 70s and 80s. When Netflix released the Fear Street trilogy, some popular press commentators made comparisons between the Fear Street trilogy and Netflix's other popular horror-related property, Stranger Things. Now, this is an easy surface comparison to make, given the heavy integration of popular music and cultural references appropriate to the show's respective periods, as well as the presence of actors Sophie Sink and Maya Hawke in both series. Though nostalgia, both personal or historical, are key aspects to both shows' properties, the two shows diverge in how they handle issues of diversity, equality, inclusion, and social justice. Now, though both series involve Black and LGBTQ plus characters, they treat the social and structural barriers that each of these characters face differently. For example, Dr. Vanessa Hintz, a therapist and diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, argues that Stranger Things pays only a cursory glance to systemic racism and largely ignores the racial tensions that persons of color, especially Black Americans, would have experienced in the 1980s, especially in central Indiana. Similarly, Dr. Travis Langley, professor of psychology and editor of the book Stranger Things Psychology, Life Upside Down, argues that the show thus far has only paid brief attention to homophobia yoked to the emerging HIV/AIDS epidemic in 1980s America. The Fear Street trilogy, however, tackles these subjects directly. Janik acknowledged the central tension of adapting a nostalgic property set in a specific period. Quote, "How do we have a healthy dose of nostalgia, but also make it feel like something else?" Unquote. Janik argued she wanted to have characters who represented social outsiders, which she felt always was a core theme of the original Fear Street books. And she used this iteration to tackle relevant social justice issues, such as systemic inequality, intergenerational trauma, racialized police violence, and homophobia. Janik infuses these issues throughout all three films, both in terms of key plot points and characterization moments of interpersonal tension. Further, she intentionally provides these marginalized characters the opportunity to break through their collective traumas and overcome the odds stacked against them. As the character Dina says right before they confront Sheriff Good in the third film, just because we're weird and smart and different doesn't mean they can feed us through their meat grinder. Indeed, the surviving characters of these films are three women, two of them who are queer, one character played by a multiracial actor, and two black men, characters who Janik argued normally would have died in horror films of the previous decades. Netflix's Fear Street trilogy was the trilogy I did not know that I needed until after I saw it. I'm a huge horror fan, and I grew up during the same time as the main characters. I listened to the same bands they did, played the same video games, and used the same slow dial-up modem for America Online 2.0's Instant Messenger. Now, I still would have enjoyed this trilogy if it were released in 2019 or even today, but I doubt it would have had the same psychological impact on me. Why? Well, I saw it during the height of the pandemic, where though many places were starting to come out of lockdown, masks were still required. Like many people around the world, the pandemic was taking its toll on my mental health, and I was struggling with insomnia. Reading the daily news provided a constant source of existential threat. Recall that nostalgia provides psychological resources to satisfy our needs for belonging, meaning, and a positive, coherent sense of self, especially after events that make one ponder their own mortality. Thus, the Fear Street trilogy's three-course dose of nostalgia provided me the needed psychological relief. I suspect that there were other members of Generation Y who felt similarly. I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Jay Bennett and all of the folks working hard behind the scenes to put the fans conference on and affording me the opportunity to hang out with you in hybrid fashion. Also, thanks to all of you for being willing to listen / watch this video. You can find me by going to the Department of Psychology's webpage at Illinois State University, as well as on Twitter at Eric Wesselmann, and by using the QR code on the screen to find my YouTube page, Digital Golgotha Productions. On that page, I have some of my previous virtual conference presentations linked, as well as several video podcasts where I have deep dive conversations with scholars and creators on fan-related topics.